I want to talk a little bit about how this book came into being. I had been casting about, if I go back to 2013, I had been casting about for a new project. I had just finished my previous book, The Wired City, which is about hyperlocal community journalism. And an editor and I had been batting some ideas around. And in one weekend, in August of 2013, this idea came together. On a Friday, we learned that John Henry, the principal owner of the Red Sox, was going to buy the Boston Globe. We had barely begun to absorb that news when the following Monday came a much more startling piece of news. Jeff Bezos of Amazon was going to buy the Washington Post. So all of a sudden we had two incredibly wealthy people coming onto the newspaper scene after years of serious business problems for the newspaper business. So we thought, well, gee, here are two people who might be able to figure it out. Now, in journalism, I always tell my students this, you need three to make a trend. And I only had two. However, at the same time, Aaron Kushner, a young entrepreneur from Boston, was getting rave reviews for the way he was building up the Orange County Register in Southern California. He had been doing this for the previous year. And a pretty fair amount of the book is actually devoted to Aaron Kushner's efforts, and it's an entertaining story to say the least. But he ended up not making the cover, and we'll see why he didn't make the cover. Now, here is a mogul. Charles Foster Kane, played by Orson Welles, based on the life of William Randolph Hearst. My editor and I decided to use the term moguls to describe these wealthy new owners, but they're a different type of mogul. If you look back at the first breed of newspaper mogul, people like Hearst, Joseph Pulitzer, for that matter, the Taylor family, which owned the Globe, the Sulzberger family, which owned the Times, much more low-key, but they were all people who either made their fortune or expanded their fortune in the newspaper business. Today, no one is doing that. So the hope was that these moguls who had made their money in other facets of life would be able to apply what they had learned and help show a new way forward for the newspaper business. Now, my promise to you tonight is that this is the only chart I'm going to show you. But it tells quite a story, and it's worth taking a look at. This really shows you what the problem is facing the news business, and it also tells you how the theme for my book came together. In 2013, I knew I was going to follow these three rich guys, but it took a while to really understand what they were faced with specifically. So you look over here, and you see this blue line. It tracks newspaper advertising revenue, and it went from about, this is all inflation adjusted, but it went from about $20 billion in the entire industry in 1950 all the way up to $67 billion around the year 2000. And then it fell off a cliff. It absolutely fell off a cliff. I should say that the blue is print advertising. The red, this little red line here, is print plus digital. This is the advertising that appeared on newspaper websites. And as you see, it never amounted to much of anything. It really didn't amount to much of anything at all. And then meanwhile, you've got Google and Facebook coming onto the scene and starting to make a huge amount of money. So what happened? When newspapers started down the road of putting their content on the web in the mid-90s, they decided that they were going to offer their news for free. And it's one of those things where I say it seemed like a good idea at the time. It wasn't crazy. You sometimes hear people today say that was the stupidest thing they ever did. It really wasn't. It really wasn't. Let me explain. Traditionally, newspapers got 85% of their revenue from advertising. Only 15% came from readers. And the 15% really just covered the cost of printing and distribution. So when you say, well, okay, eventually we can move toward getting rid of the cost of printing and distribution, because printing on the web is much, much cheaper, maybe we can just give it away and be completely advertiser supported, as television news is, for instance. Several things happened. First of all, classified ads. You know what classifieds are. Those are those pages and pages of little ads, help wanteds, things like that. They were the reason that it used to take 2 people to bring in the Sunday Globe from your front doorstep. They disappeared. Those were 40% of a typical newspaper's revenues were classified ads. Craigslist came along, and that was it. They were gone. No more, all gone. Newspaper executives had assumed that classifieds were going to be great for them. We're going to make them searchable and be able to do more with them than you were before. It never occurred to them that somebody was going to come along and give them away. Craigslist does charge a little bit for a few different types of ads, but for the most part, it's free. Newspapers overcharged for classified ads and used the money to partly to enrich their owners, but partly to support their journalism. And that source of revenue was completely gone. I sometimes hear people say, newspapers should have beaten Craigslist. They should have gotten into the free classified space before Craigslist did. To which I always say, why? What is in it for newspapers if you're not making any money from it? I'll give you just one little statistic here. The last time I checked, Craigslist had about 40 full-time employees worldwide. To this day, even with all the shrinkage that's taken place over the years, the Globe has about 220 full-time journalists. So you see, that doesn't work. So there's 40% of the money gone. Display ads, that was everything else. Bank ads, department store ads, you name it. Those pages and pages of Jordan Marsh ads, they're still around to some extent when you get the print newspaper, although there's not as many of them as there used to be. But they did not make a good transition to the web. What we have on the web are banner ads, right? People don't like banner ads. People like print ads. They say, oh, this is interesting. It's content. A friend of mine likes to say advertising is content. But on the internet, they're just kind of in the way. I don't think anybody has ever clicked on a banner ad except by mistake. So that ended up being a declining source of revenue, especially since the internet is infinite. And when something is infinite, the cost of something goes way down. With a newspaper, there's a certain number of pages, and so advertising maintains its value. When you have the infinite space of the internet, the value of advertising drops through the floor. And there's just a few companies who have the enormous reach and the small number of employees needed to make a lot of money from digital advertising. And they are largely Google and Facebook. Google and Facebook today capture more than 90% of all new spending on digital advertising. So what I began to realize was that my 3 moguls, Jeff Bezos, John Henry, and Aaron Kushner, had all come on the scene at a time when they had to figure out how are we going to get our readers to pay for the news again. And I'd like to think the story is a little more entertaining than that, but that's the essential organizing principle of the book. I should have called it The Return of the Moguls plus Sex, right? They always say, do that. You'll sell more books. But I did try to make it a little more entertaining than that. Now, I'm going to start with my three moguls, and Aaron Kushner, I'm kind of going from bottom to top here. Aaron Kushner, no relation to Jared Kushner. When I was doing my reporting for the book, Jared Kushner was not on the scene. But as I was wrapping it up, all of a sudden, Jared Kushner was among us. And I said, gee, I better ask. Jared Kushner, by the way, used to own a newspaper. I thought it's not unreasonable to think that there might be some relation there. So I asked Kushner, and he said, no, not that I know of. And we both overlooked the irony of somebody named Kennedy asking, are you related to the Kushner? So anyway, Aaron Kushner was a young entrepreneur who made his money at a .com and later got into the greeting card business of all things. In 2010, he decided he wanted to buy the Boston Globe. His timing was not good. The New York Times Company, which owned it at that time, had tried to sell the Globe the year before. You may remember that in 2009, the Times Company was actually threatening to shut down the Globe if it couldn't get concessions from the unions. And then they tried to sell it. They couldn't get the price they wanted, so they said, okay, we're going to keep it for a few more years. And then Kushner comes along right after this and says, I want to buy the Globe. And they said, too late. So that didn't happen. He nearly bought the, the Portland Press Herald in Maine. And he was asking for concessions from the unions. I interviewed the heads of the unions. They did not like Kushner at all. And they ended up going behind his back to another Maine billionaire named Donald Sussman and talked him into buying the Press Herald. So now you have this crazy situation where absolutely nobody wants to buy a newspaper. Aaron Kushner desperately wants to buy a newspaper, and he's been turned down twice. But finally, in mid-2012, he and a group of investors were able to buy the Orange County Register, which is a fascinating paper that's had many ups and downs over the years. But when Kushner bought it, it was at a real down point. And he went about the business of building it up. For that period from mid-2012 when he bought the Register up until Bezos and Henry came on the scene a year later, Kushner was probably the most celebrated newspaper owner in the country. Why was that? Well, he improved the paper. He put a huge emphasis on the print edition. He said, we'll continue to have a website, but if you want to buy the paper, it'll cost you $1 a day. And if you want to read it online, it will cost you $1 a day. Well, I really want to emphasize print. Even the quality of the paper stock was improved. That was the first thing he did. He went on a hiring spree and launched papers, bought papers, building himself a little bit of an empire. But then he was forced out in 2015, and the Register today is owned by a company called Digital First Media, which is the company that bought the Boston Herald earlier this year and is in the process of driving it into the ground. The Herald's long-term prospects were rather grim, but you didn't have to come along and force it to climb into the coffin and then start, putting the nails in it. And unfortunately, that's what Digital First Media is doing to the Herald. And it's what they've done to all of their properties, including the Orange County Register. So where did Aaron Kushner go wrong? there's still value in print. There isn't as much advertising as there used to be, but most newspapers continue to make most of their revenue from print. That includes the Globe. It even includes the Washington Post, believe it or not. So it wasn't crazy to think that a bigger, better paper would do well. Now the next slide is where you're supposed to go, oh my God. Kushner came in with a staff of 180 full-time journalists and added 150 people to it in a matter of months, just a few months. It made no sense. He did not have Jeff Bezos and John Henry money. He was a wealthy guy, he still is, but he had to work with investors. And he made his big bet, the bet failed, and that was it for him. I'll tell you a funny story. I went out to Southern California in March of 2015 to do some interviews for the book. And I wasn't sure that Kushner would see me, but at the last minute, he agreed to see me. So I go out to Southern California, and I was literally in the cafeteria at the LA Times talking to some people when somebody came over and said, Kushner's board just pushed him out. I said, oh, I was supposed to see him the next day. Now at this point, Kushner had been losing his authority over a period of months, and it wasn't a shock that he would be pushed out. But I was thinking, you know, this could have waited a week. But I emailed him. I said, Aaron, I'm here. What better time to tell me what went wrong than right now? And he said, I'll think about it. And he ultimately decided not to. And I spent a year and a half trying to get him to give me an interview. And he just wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. I'm getting a little bit frustrated because the one person I was not able to interview was Jeff Bezos, and he doesn't talk to anybody. So I didn't feel too bad about that. But not to get Aaron Kushner? You got to be kidding. Finally, I contacted Kushner one more time, and I said, the train is leaving the station. If you don't agree to an interview now, we're going to have to do the book without you. Up till that point, I think that he might have thought that if he kept saying no, there wouldn't be a book. But at this point, he realized actually there was. So we actually had 2 long conversations. He is not known for being particularly reflective, especially when it comes to his mistakes. But I thought he was pretty good when we talked. And I asked him, why did you add 150 people to your staff immediately? How did you think that was going to work out? And he said, well, you know, in retrospect, I wish I'd spread it out over 10 years. Yeah, I think so. I think so. I guess he thought that advertisers and readers would be so grateful for what he was doing for them that they would shower him with money. And they didn't. And so that ended Aaron Kushner's dream. Now, his plans were so outlandish that it's easy to make a little fun of what he did. But, you know, this was a civic-minded guy who really believed in the power of newspapers to build community. And the outlandishness of his plans aside, it's really a shame that it didn't work out. Certainly the Orange County Register would be a much better paper today than what it is. Now this brings me to John Henry. John Henry is still, here we are 5 years into the John Henry ownership. He closed on the sale in November of 2013, and we still don't know how it's going to work out. It's still kind of up in the air. He's won, 2 championships with the Red Sox during this time, and we still don't know how things are going to work out with the Globe. So John Henry bought the Globe in 2013 from the New York Times Company. The Times Company had bought the Globe in 1993 for $1.1 billion. That was half the stock market valuation of the New York Times Company at that time. It was a huge gamble. And the Globe actually made a lot of money for the Times Company until around 2005. And then it all started to come apart. And Henry ended up buying the Globe for $70 million. Not just $70 million, not just the Globe, but the Worcester Telegram and Gazette and some other properties. So the Globe had lost almost all of its value. In fact, I think you could say that the Globe had lost all of its value. He turned around and sold the Worcester paper for about $18 million. And I think it was earlier this year, he sold the land that the Globe was, that the Globe property was on, the Globe plant was on, for $80 million. So there's like a profit. Now, some people say, oh, it was just a real estate deal. He has sunk a lot of money into the Globe. It still loses money. He sunk a lot of money into the Taunton Plant, which has been a disaster, which we'll talk about. So the Globe has been a tough investment for him. He certainly didn't get into it to make money. But when it came to the property, he did pretty well. Even though the Globe is a smaller paper than it is today, it has suffered many fewer cuts than many papers of similar size. I'll give you an example. I mentioned Digital First. Probably Digital First's biggest paper is the Denver Post. Similar to Boston in terms of size, the reach of the paper, all of that. The Globe, as I mentioned, has about 220 full-time journalists today. The Denver Post has about 60. So you can see that Henry has done what he can to try to keep the Globe alive. What has his strategy been? I would describe it as throwing things against the wall and seeing what will stick. Some of it sticks. He tried expanded print editions. He started a political supplement called Capital. It did pretty well in 2015 when there was a hot state political race. After the election, the ads disappeared, so they stopped printing Capital. They expanded the business and arts sections and then shrunk them back again when they failed to attract the advertising they were hoping for. I was just talking about this before I started up here tonight, but they also have a weekly football supplement called Score that comes out on Mondays. And that seems to have done pretty well, except that there doesn't seem to be any advertising in that either. It's a very, very tough environment for advertising. Henry also started some special online projects to cover specialty topics, hoping that that might return some money to the Globe. They started a website that covers the Catholic Church called Crux, and the hope was that they would take, they could take advantage of interest in Pope Francis. And editorially, it did very well. The journalism was quite interesting. As a lifelong non-Catholic, I would read it from time to time, and I always learned something from it. But they ended up spinning it off and removing it from the Globe because they said it didn't attract the advertising we were expecting. And I'm thinking, you have a small specialty website covering the Catholic Church. What were you expecting? Were you expecting Papa John's pizza ads? In fact, if you went to the site, it had the sort of ads that you might see in the pilot. It's become a priest, become a nun, that sort of thing. Perfectly fine ads, but it wasn't bringing in much in the way of money. Rather than fold it, they let the columnist they had hired to be their star writer take it with him. His name is John Allen, and he continues to publish it under the sponsorship of the Knights of Columbus, and it does okay. A more successful project has been STAT. This is STAT. It covers health and life sciences. It's huge. It was 40 to 50 people when it launched. They've done okay because of what I talked about with regard to online advertising. They're now emphasizing more paid content, more of a subscription model. They've done all right. But one characteristic of the Henry ownership that they have got to get a handle on is they have a lot of good ideas and terrible execution. Terrible execution. I couldn't resist this picture. As some of you know, a few years ago, they tried to change their home delivery vendor. It was a disaster. And in a few weeks, they switched back to the original vendor. Of more lasting damage, in the summer of 2017, they opened a new printing plant in Taunton. Now, this allowed them to move the news and business offices to downtown Boston into cheaper space, although it's not cheap, it's in a very high rent district. That's worked out pretty well for them, but the Taunton plant has not worked out well for them. For months, papers were late, the quality was bad. Their hope was that they were going to be adding other newspapers as customers. Well, they've lost the Boston Herald, they've lost USA Today, they still have the New York Times. It has not been a good situation at all. And where they had hoped to make $30 million a year by moving to cheaper space and having a more efficient printing operation, it just hasn't materialized. Their revenues were about $300 million a year when I was doing my reporting. It's less than that now, and these savings never materialized. They may at some point down the line. I hope they do, but so far, not so good. Probably the most important strategy that the Globe has pursued is that they charge readers a lot of money. This is something that John Henry has really believed in from the beginning. And even if you have a digital-only subscription, which is their future, even though they're going to keep printing the paper for as long as people are willing to pay for it, they've done well with digital subscriptions at $30 a month, which is more than anyone else charges. It's more expensive than the Washington Post or the New York Times. You ask why? Well, we'll get to this in a moment, but the Times and the Post are able to appeal to a national audience and build a big base of digital subscribers. The Globe is pretty much stuck with Eastern Massachusetts. Nobody outside of that area cares what they're doing. So they're going to get fewer subscribers and they have to charge them more. The Globe did pass 100,000 earlier this summer. They have said that if they can get to 200,000 digital subscribers, it starts to look like a sustainable business. But as my mother always said, the first 100,000 is the easiest. So we'll see how that goes. And because the newsroom is smaller, the editor, Brian McGrory, led an effort to try to reorganize the newsroom, to try to figure out how to use their resources more efficiently at a time when you can't have a reporter full-time at every courthouse, for instance. Okay, we've got Jane out at the Suffolk courthouse. It's 4 o'clock, let's see what she's got. Hey Jane, any stories today? Nope, okay, we'll get back to you tomorrow. They can't afford to do that anymore, so they have to try to be more efficient in their use of staff. Now this brings me to Jeff Bezos, the one unalloyed success story of my three moguls. The legendary Graham family, Catherine Graham, Donald Graham, Phil Graham. The newspaper business had shrunk to the point where the Grahams could no longer preside over a publicly traded company. Now the Post, like the Times still is organized in such a way that the voting stock rested with the Graham family. But nevertheless, they had obligations to their stockholders. And so When Don Graham sold the Post to Jeff Bezos, the Post was profitable. But Don Graham said, it's profitable because we're cutting. I want to see if we can get an owner who can make it profitable while growing. And he's been able to do just that. Bezos took the Post private. It's completely independent of his Amazon holdings. He only spent $250 million, which in some ways is even more shocking than the $70 million that John Henry paid for the Globe. I assume that Bezos found it in a spare pants pocket. So what has the Bezos agenda been? Essentially, he has, the most important decision that Jeff Bezos made was he resolved a debate that had been going on at the Post for decades. And that is, are we a large regional newspaper or are we a national newspaper? And in fact, the Post had always been a large regional newspaper, more like the Globe or the Philadelphia Inquirer than it was like the Times or the Wall Street Journal. Naturally, there was national interest in it because it was in Washington. But it was really a big regional newspaper. In fact, during the last few years of Graham family ownership, their slogan was, of Washington, for Washington. And Bezos came in and he said, we're now a national news organization. And we're going to be a national digital news organization. We're not going to try to distribute print nationally the way the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal do. We'll go digital. We'll continue to publish a print edition for people who live in the Washington area, but that's it. He's leveraged it with Amazon in some very interesting ways. You get a Kindle Fire, there's an app for the Washington Post pre-installed. If you are an Amazon Prime member, and I guess most people are these days, you can get the Post at a huge discount. The idea is to compete with the New York Times in the national digital space. There's nothing, an aside, the hardest place to be in the news business these days is owning a large regional newspaper. John Henry has an extremely difficult task. Aaron Kushner failed at the same task. Bezos sensed that there was still room at the top for one more high-quality news organization. So that's what he's done, and he has Marty Baron as his editor, maybe the best editor in the business. By the way, people think of Jeff Bezos as this big change agent, and of course he is, but he inherited Marty Baron. He instantly understood that this was not a guy that he wanted to get rid of. And the Grahams had hired a chief technologist named Shailesh Prakash. And you'd think, well, Bezos is certainly going to want his own technology person. And he met Prakash and said, this guy's great. So he's left him in place. I think Bezos tortures him, but nevertheless, he's kept him in place. The Post digital products are a pleasure to use, as are the New York Times. The Globe, better than many papers, but improvement is needed. So this is an actual customer engagement funnel. I'm going to wrap this up in a minute or two. There's some stuff here that we don't really need to talk about much, but I just wanted to talk about this business concept of a customer engagement funnel and how the Post uses it. By the way, every newspaper is trying to do this, but the Post is especially good at it. The top of the funnel is this huge drive-by traffic that the Post has been able to build. 80 to 100 million unique visitors a month to the Post website, similar to the New York Times. The Post was much smaller than the Times when Bezos first bought the paper. Now, because of what I talked about regarding digital advertising, that huge digital audience doesn't really get you much. The idea is to pull people down through the funnel until they become paying customers. That's the idea. You become a paying customer. So you start encountering Post journalism on Facebook, friends are sharing it with you, you read a few stories, and then the Post recommends a newsletter to you, an electronic newsletter. Again, nothing special about a newsletter strategy. Everybody's got a newsletter. But the Post has their own technology for doing this, and they're very good at recommending what they think you might be interested in. I should say pretty good. They recommended to me a newsletter they put out called The Optimist, and it's like, are you kidding? But nevertheless, now you're looking at a Post newsletter, so you're reading more Post journalism. And pretty soon you're up against that paywall. If you want to read any more stories this week, you gotta pay. So you become a paying subscriber and it moves you down through the funnel. And the Post is, I haven't checked the price lately, but it's about half what you pay to get the Globe. It's also cheaper than what you pay to get the New York Times. And as I said, there's Amazon Prime discounts, there's Kindle Fire discounts. So the idea is to build up a huge audience and get many, many people to pay a little bit. The Post doesn't report numbers very often. It's privately held. And Bezos is a very secretive guy. The last time they reported numbers, they said that they had more than 1 million paying digital subscribers. The New York Times has about 3 million, but the Post is catching up. In fact, I suspect it's much more than 1 million today. They haven't reported for quite a while. The Post also claims to have been profitable each of the past 2 years. Again, they don't show their numbers, so we don't know what they mean by profitable. It may not be profitable by generally acceptable accounting standards, but they're doing pretty well. They're certainly doing pretty well.